In our last video, we covered the death of the traditional oligarchic political systems and the rise of a much harsher and less competitive form of authoritarian regime across much of Latin America in the 1930s. The Latin American dictatorships of the 30s were repressive and patently undemocratic, but they never came close to matching the brutality, mass support, and cohesion of the fascist regimes that governed much of Europe during that decade. Many Latin American far-right parties and movements did consciously copy fascist symbolism and trappings. But those far-right groups that came to power in Latin America in the 30s never followed through on building a fascist regime. And the far-right movements that probably would have constructed fascist regimes in Latin America never came close to holding executive power. In this video, we are going to examine why fascism failed to take root in Latin America, at least during the interwar era. As was the case with our video on anarchism in Latin America, we need to start this video by tackling some definitional issues. There is no single universally accepted definition of fascism, and one of the reasons why it is such a difficult concept to define is because it is often ambiguous whether we are talking about fascism as a regime or fascism as a political movement. A fascist movement that is in the opposition will not necessarily do or say the same things as a governing fascist regime would. And fascist movements that come to power do not always consolidate fascist regimes. There is also some disagreement about whether fascist regimes and movements alike should be defined by the ideological project that they are trying to carry out, or by the political style, trappings, and organizational tactics that they employ. As an ideological project, fascists seek to create a very specific type of authoritarian state that uses the coercive powers of the state to destroy those whom the fascists perceive as the enemy. This is more than a mere hostility to elections and liberal democracy. It is about using the state to carry out systematic violence against specific groups that the fascists want to eliminate. Fascism is also based on a reactionary form of nationalism that idealizes a largely fictional narrative about the nation's past glories. In the fascist view, the nation has become degraded and decadent, and the fascist regime is supposed to rejuvenate the nation by dispensing with the nation's internal and external enemies and by imposing order on society. This style of nationalism also goes hand in hand with the fascist obsession with racial, ethnic, and national purity, the belief that some races are superior to others, and the belief that racial minorities are one of the key groups that the fascist state must either subjugate or eliminate. Another key enemy of fascism is the organized working class, especially in the form of the socialist-led labor movement, and interwar European fascist movements were able to attract many adherents from the middle class by invoking middle-class anxieties about socialism and the general advancement of the working class in the early 20th century. Finally, fascism calls for the reorganization of society along corporatist lines. Under the fascist version of corporatism, citizens would interact with the state not as isolated voters, but as members of broad interest groups based primarily on a person's type of employment. These interest groups will be hierarchically controlled by the fascist regime and used to regulate the interaction of the different components of society as a way of eliminating class conflict. This is the ideological project of fascism. But many scholars who use the word fascist to describe a regime are referring not to its ideological content, but rather to its political style or the way that it organizes and conducts its politics. In stylistic terms, fascist movements and regimes are often led by a single charismatic leader who may develop and institutionalize a cult of personality once he is in power. The fascist movement and regime are also based on a strong mass party that is extremely hierarchical and militaristic, and which becomes the sole legal party once the fascist regime consolidates. The movement also employs targeted violence against other parties while it is still in the opposition, followed by much more systematic and widespread state-directed violence and repression once it is in power. The lack of agreement over whether the word fascist refers to a government regime, political movement, ideological project, or political style becomes an issue when we try to apply the term outside of the context of interwar Europe, because movements and regimes in other parts of the world often emulate some elements of fascism while rejecting others. In the 1930s and 40s, several Latin American countries developed a type of populist regime that is sometimes accused of being a Latin American form of fascism, especially in the English-speaking world. And it is true that many of these regimes did the whole cult of personality thing. They loved their large mass rallies, and some of them also embraced the organizational elements of fascism, including a corporatist organization of society into interest groups that would be tied and controlled by the ruling party. The Latin American classic populist regimes were also staunchly nationalist, and they sometimes portrayed themselves as saviors of the nation and guardians of the national dignity who had liberated their countries from foreign influences. So there are some similarities to European fascism. But when we look closer, we also observe a ton of differences. First off, while European fascist nationalism was an expansionist ultranationalism that sought to subjugate other nations, the Latin American classic populist nationalism was mostly about self-determination and anti-imperialism. And in this way, it was diametrically opposed to the fascistic ultranationalism. The Latin American classic populist regimes also lacked the racism, systematic repression, and hostility to elections of European fascist regimes. They had a predominantly working class base. They aligned themselves with organized labor and marginalized groups in society, and they pursued a downward redistribution of the nation's wealth from the rich to the poor. And to the extent that the Latin American regimes even had a governing party, they tended to prefer a very fluid and non-militaristic party organization. Because of all these differences, I do not consider any of these Latin American classic populist regimes to be a form of fascist regime. Their leaders may have admired European fascism, but any similarities between fascism and the regimes that they actually constructed are mostly cosmetic and superficial rather than substantive. But there were genuine fascist movements in Latin America in the 1930s. Movements that openly described themselves as fascist and which advocated a specifically fascist ideological project based on fascist tactics. These Latin American movements often looked directly to European fascist movements for inspiration and, in many cases, for financial backing as well. The rise of Nazism in Germany in the early 30s inspired several Latin American spin-offs, the most important of which was the Chilean Nacista party. The German brown shirts and Italian black shirts inspired similar fascist paramilitary organizations such as the gold shirts of Mexico and the green shirts of Brazil. Far-right groups in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Peru attempted to build mass fascist parties that were modeled on the German Nazi Party and the Italian National Fascist Party. And several Latin American Catholic movements drew inspiration from the clerical fascism of the Spanish Falange. which was co-opted by Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War and transformed into the official party of the Francoist regime in Spain. Some of these movements, like the Chilean Falangistas, briefly adopted fascist trappings without ever truly embracing a fascist ideology. But other groups like the Chilean Nacistas and the Brazilian Integralistas were unambiguously fascist in both ideological and stylistic terms. And for the rest of this video, we are going to look at how these two movements emerged and why they ultimately failed to come to power. We are going to begin with the Chilean Nacista Party, which was the largest Nazi party in the Americas during the interwar period. The Chilean Nacista Party was founded and led by Jorge González Van Mores, the Chilean-born son of a German immigrant to Chile. González Van Mores bases his Chilean Nazismo on German Nazism, but he also tries to adapt Nazism to political conditions in Chile by infusing it with Chile's own authoritarian traditions, such as the conservatism of Diego Portales in the early 19th century. Much of the Chilean Nacistas' early support comes from the German immigrant communities based in southern Chile, though they eventually begin to attract some adherents from the broader Chilean urban middle class as well, which has grown disillusioned with traditional party politics during the Great Depression. The party's vote total in municipal elections increases from around 6,000 in 1935 to over 22,000 in 1938, which corresponds to around 4% of the electorate, or roughly the same size as the German Nazi Party throughout the 1920s, before its surge in membership. Although the Chilean Nacistas are still a minority movement in the Chilean electorate, they managed to convince themselves that they have deep support within the Chilean military, and they decide that Chile's 1938 presidential election is an ideal moment for them to seize power. For this presidential election, the Nacista Party supports the candidacy of Carlos Ibáñez, the former military dictator whom we met in our last video. Ibáñez is not a Nazi, but the Nacistas see him as someone that they can work with and either convert to their cause down the road or push aside later on. In the short term, Ibáñez's campaign gives the Nacistas a pretext for organizing out in the open. On September 4th, 1938, Ibáñez holds a major campaign rally in Santiago, and Nacistas from throughout the country pour into the capital to attend. But for many of the Nacistas, this campaign rally appears to have been mostly just an excuse for them to all gather in the same place. Because the very next day, on September 5th, a group of Nacistas from the party's paramilitary wing stage a coup attempt that is aimed at overthrowing the democratic government and preempting the upcoming election. Around noon that day, the Nacistas seized control over a government building called the Seguro Obrero, or Workers' Insurance Building, which literally towers over Chile's presidential palace, La Moneda. At the same time, another group of Nacistas seized control over the University of Chile's Casa Central, which is located on the opposite side of the presidential palace, and the Nacistas take several hostages there. There are only a couple dozen Nacistas in both buildings, and the Nacistas were evidently hoping that these initial insurrections would spark a mutiny by the pro-Ibáñez sectors of the military. But instead of joining the Nacista cause, the artillery opens fire onto the Nacista-occupied University of Chile building, and a firefight ensues on the plaza that lies between the Seguro Obrero building and the presidential palace. After a brief standoff, the government forces storm the building, the Nacista participants in this coup attempt are apprehended and disarmed, and they are lined up against a wall and summarily executed by the government forces. In the aftermath of this failed coup attempt, Carlos Ibáñez withdraws his presidential candidacy, and the Nacista leader, González Van Mores, surrenders himself into police custody. The Chilean Nacista movement never really recovers from the failure of this 1938 coup. González von Moraes is released after the election is over, and he eventually tries to found a new, less overtly fascist political party, but this party is even less successful than the now banned Nacista party. González von Moraes eventually becomes disillusioned with fascism altogether during the 1940s, and he ultimately joins Chile's Liberal Party, the same party that was in power at the time of the Nacista's coup attempt in 1938. Our second Latin American fascist movement, the Integralist movement of Brazil, was by far the largest fascist mass party in Latin America in the 30s. But the Integralistas are ultimately no more successful than the Chilean Nacistas at gaining national level executive power. The leading figure in the Integralista movement is Plinio Salgado. Salgado starts out as a fairly typical machine politician under Brazil's old republic. His father was a coronel, and Plinio himself eventually gets elected to the Sao Paulo legislature in the late 20s. But he ends his term early in order to take a trip to Europe, and during that time he comes to admire the Italian fascist regime, and he decides to develop a Brazilian form of fascism that is based on a combination of Italian fascism and Catholic social teaching. He returns to Brazil and he founds a new fascist political party called the Brazilian Integralist Action. Like the Chilean Nacistas, the Integralists recruit mainly in European immigrant communities at first, but they eventually make headway into the broader Brazilian society, and they reach around 1 million members by 1935. A big factor that aids the Integralist recruitment is that they do not face much competition from rival political parties. Those old political machines have fallen into decline, and they were not very effective at mobilizing mass support anyway. So throughout most of Brazil, if you don't like machine politics and you want to belong to a mass party instead, your only two real options are to join the Communist Party or the Integralist Party. And much like the most successful fascist movements of Europe, the Brazilian Integralists are able to attract much of the Brazilian middle class to their cause by playing on middle-class anxieties about the communists and Brazil's working class. Meanwhile, the President Getúlio Vargas has just finished his first term as president, and as he begins his second term, his government is now drifting in a more authoritarian direction. Vargas has already burned through most of his initial allies that got him into power in 1930, and so at the start of his second term, he enters into a loose alliance with the Integralists, who share his interest in repressing the Brazilian Communist Party. During the mid-30s, the Integralists carry out a series of attacks against communist members that have the tacit support of Vargas's government. But Vargas always keeps the Integralists at arm's length, and his distrust of the Integralist movement becomes especially clear in 1935, when the communists stage an uprising with the support of left-wing factions of the military. The Integralists pledge the government their full support, and Plinio Salgado offers to mobilize the Integralist paramilitary wing, the Green Shirts, against the communists. But Vargas turns down this offer, and he relies solely on the actual military to repress the communist uprising. After the failure of the communist uprising, Plinio Salgado and Getúlio Vargas discuss forming an even closer alliance that might have transformed the Integralist Party into the official party of the Vargas regime, similar to the Falange in Francoist Spain. But these talks ultimately break down due to opposition from the Integralist rank and file and interpersonal conflicts stemming from the fact that Salgado and Vargas both coveted the presidency. Vargas is now reaching the end of his second term as president, and he is constitutionally ineligible to run for a third term. Clínio Salgado emerges as one of the three main contenders in Brazil's 1938 presidential election, and given the size and organizational strength of the Integralist Party at the time, it is plausible that Salgado could have beaten the candidates backed by Vargas and the São Paulo political machine. But in the end, this 1938 election never takes place because Vargas is not ready to let go of power, and he preempts the election by staging a self-coup in late 1937 that closes the Congress, suspends the Constitution, and inaugurates the most authoritarian phase of Vargas' government, known as the Estado Novo, or New State. Vargas then shocks his integralist allies by banning both their party and their paramilitary wing. For by now, Vargas has come to see the integralists as the greatest threat to his regime. Furious by this betrayal, the integralists stage a coup attempt of their own against Vargas' government in 1938, and they attempt to capture Vargas by seizing control over his residence in Rio de Janeiro. But this coup attempt is poorly organized, and most of the participants are quickly captured. In the aftermath of this failed coup, Vargas unleashes a much heavier wave of repression against the integralist movement. Thousands of integralists are arrested, Clínio Salgado is exiled to Portugal, and what is left of the now underground integralist movement quickly dissipates. So why did the fascist movements in Chile, Brazil, and other Latin American countries fail to seize power like their European counterparts did? A large part of the reason has to do with timing. Although the first fascist regime came to power in Italy in the early 20s, it is not really until the rise of the Nazis in the 30s and then the Spanish Civil War that the Latin American far right begins to see fascism as a model that might be exported to Latin America. It is also around this time that the fascist governments in both Italy and Germany launch a campaign to identify and fund potential fascist activists in Latin America who might be able to construct fascist movements in their own countries. Not surprisingly, all of the Latin American fascist movements that I had mentioned in this video were founded sometime between 1932 and 1937. But Latin American fascism is also constrained on the back end by the United States and Latin America's entry into World War II. Although the United States probably would have tolerated a fascist regime in Latin America in the 1930s, this simply was not an option after 1941. And even non-fascist Latin American leaders who were perceived as being too sympathetic to the Axis were overthrown by their own militaries in the early 1940s, possibly with the support of the US government. This means that a Latin American fascist movement really had the span of around 1 decade in which to form, build a base of mass support, and seize power, and most of this decade occurs during the 1930s. And this is a big problem for aspiring Latin American fascists, because the 1930s are a much less conducive environment for building a strong fascist movement in Latin America compared to Western Europe. One of the ways that European fascists attracted the support of the middle class was by invoking the supposedly imminent threat posed by their country's Marxist left, which the country's existing liberal democracies was supposedly incapable of addressing. But claims about a leftist threat are far less plausible in Latin America in the 1930s, as Latin America was already governed by authoritarian regimes that were actively repressing the left on their own. A second factor that aided the rise of European fascism was the reactionary nature of the European middle class during the interwar period. Throughout much of Europe, the middle class felt threatened by working class labor militancy, and white-collar workers also faced some of the most extreme declines in their standard of living during the Great Depression. And not surprisingly, this class became one of the firmest bases of support for European fascism. But it does not play out this way in Latin America. The middle class in Latin America is still pretty small in the 1930s, and this class leans pretty far to the left politically. Latin America is just now coming out of generations of oligarchic rule, and the middle class's main grievances are not against the working class, but rather against the traditional economic elite that has refused to cede any political power for generations. To many middle-class Latin Americans who are now seeing their standard of living decline during the Great Depression, reformist socialism actually sounds pretty appealing. For example, in Chile during the 1930s, the politically alienated and anxious middle-class elements who might have supported European fascism overwhelmingly flock to the Chilean Socialist Party, not the Chilean Nacista Party. Much of the Latin American middle class just isn't interested in what the fascists have to offer, and this lukewarm support for the middle class prevents most Latin American fascist movements from ever growing large enough to win or seize executive power. A third factor behind the rise of European fascism was the complacency and, in many cases, outright complicity of the traditional political and economic elite. Fascists ended up taking power in countries like Italy and Germany in large part because elites in these countries saw the fascists as a more appealing alternative to liberal democracy, and because they also believed that they would be able to control the fascists. But Latin American elites are not nearly this complacent by the mid-1930s. Fascist parties in Latin America were permitted to organize to the extent that they behaved like normal electoral political parties. But as soon as the fascists attempted to seize power through force, they were finished as viable political movements. The German Nazi movement was allowed to rebuild itself and ultimately thrive during the decade following its 1923 beer hall putsch. But the fascist movements in Chile and Brazil were never given this opportunity after their 1938 coup attempts. Instead, their governments violently repressed them out of existence, dealing them a fatal blow from which they were never able to recover. There continued to be scattered groups of fascists in Latin America in the mid-20th century, and some of them will ultimately end up being recruited into the military dictatorships of the late 20th century. But throughout the 1940s and 50s, fascism is a largely underground movement in Latin America whose appeal is limited mostly to a handful of European immigrant enclaves. By the end of the Second World War, the fascists in Latin America have largely given up on their attempt to organize a large mass-based political party with roots in the broader society. The era of mass-based fascism is largely over by this point, and Latin America's era of mass politics in the mid-20th century will instead be dominated by a group of reformist, populist, and leftist parties that will vehemently reject fascism and will seek to carry out a drastically different ideological project.